The man in the hoodie. The wind howled through the streets of downtown Los Angeles that Monday morning, carrying the scent of coffee and rain, mixing it with the tired sighs of a city always in motion. Among the bustle of sharp suits and polished shoes, a man in a worn hoodie and faded jeans shuffled toward the towering silver doors of Crestfall Bank. His beanie covered most of his head, and his dark eyes stayed downcast. No one gave him a second glance. If anything, some looked away, assuming he was just another drifter trying to stay warm. But Keanu Reeves wasn't just another man in the city. He didn't drive up in a sleek black car. He didn't step out with an entourage or wear a Rolex that screamed status. Instead, he walked like someone who had nothing to prove and everything to offer. A gentle humility wrapped around him like a second skin. But most didn't see that. They saw the hoodie. They saw the man. They judged, quickly. Especially the young teller behind the marble counter inside the bank. Tanner James was 26, smart, ambitious, and itching for promotion. He wore his confidence like a badge and looked at each customer as either a transaction or a time waster. When Keanu entered, Tanner glanced at him, arched a brow, and exhaled with annoyance. Another morning. Another guy without a bank account asking for change or directions. He straightened his tie and turned toward his computer screen. Keanu walked up to the counter slowly. "Hi," he said softly, voice calm but tinged with warmth. "I was hoping to check in on an account. Make a few adjustments if possible." Tanner didn't look up. "Sir, if you're looking to open an account, the new account desk is over there." He nodded dismissively toward the corner where a trainee sat nervously shuffling brochures. "No," Keanu replied with a patient smile. "I already have an account here. I just need to speak to someone." Tanner finally looked up. His eyes scanned Keanu's appearance. Hoodie, scruffy beard, worn sneakers, his mouth twisted slightly, a smirk forming at the corner. "Right, and I'm Elon Musk." Keanu chuckled lightly. "I don't think Elon wears sneakers like these." The humor was lost on Tanner. "Look, sir, we're kind of busy today. If you have a basic checking account or need to withdraw $50, the ATM's right outside. Let's save both of us some time, okay?" Keanu looked at him, eyes kind and steady. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't call for a manager. He just smiled and pulled out a small folded envelope from his jacket. He slid it across the marble counter. "Just check the name on the account, please." With an exaggerated sigh, Tanner took the envelope and typed in the account number written inside. His fingers clacked against the keys with impatience. But then his movements stopped. His posture shifted. The screen lit up with a name, and beside it, a balance that made Tanner's mouth go dry. $63,548,010.23. His jaw clenched. He blinked. The name on the account. Keanu Charles Reeves. He looked up, really looked up, for the first time. The hoodie, the beanie, the calm eyes. Recognition slowly blowed into his face, like sunlight breaking through thick fog. You're him." Keanu nodded slightly. "Yeah, but I'm also just a guy who walked in asking for a little help." Tanner swallowed hard. His confidence evaporated into panic. "Mr. Reeves, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize. I thought you were." "It's okay," Keanu said gently, lifting a hand to stop him. "That's kind of the problem, though, isn't it?" Tanner froze. Keanu leaned in a little closer, not with menace, but with quiet gravity. "You looked at me and made a decision before hearing a word I said. You saw someone who didn't fit the picture in your head of what wealthy or worthy looks like. That's not just unkind, it's dangerous." The bank grew quiet around them. Even the other customers had paused, sensing the shift in atmosphere. "I've been homeless before," Keanu continued. "I've stood in lines at soup kitchens, slept on benches, and wore the same clothes for weeks. And I'd also starred in movies, sat in million-dollar rooms, and signed autographs until my hand went numb. But you know what stayed constant through all of it? Tanner shook his head slowly. Kindness. It doesn't cost anything. And yet, it's what people remember most. The young teller looked crushed, guilt tightening across his face. You're right, he said, almost whispering. I messed up. Keanu gave him a long look, then nodded. Everyone does. What matters is what you do next. He stood up straight and smiled again, genuinely this time. Now, do you mind helping me with those adjustments? Tanner nodded quickly, fumbling to stand and motioning toward the VIP desk. Of course, Mr. Reeves. I'll take care of it personally. As Keanu walked with him toward the private suite, the whispers started. Phones were tucked away discreetly, but the energy had shifted. Keanu Reeves had walked into their bank, not with a camera crew, not with security, but with a message that echoed louder than money ever could. Outside the bank, the clouds had started to part. The morning chill was giving way to sunlight, and as the doors closed behind him, one of the customers, an elderly woman who had watched the entire exchange from her seat, leaned over and said to her granddaughter, "That man is a lesson in grace." But this story doesn't end there. Because what started with a misunderstanding at a teller's counter would soon ripple into something far bigger. A city would hear of it. A movement would stir. And a man known around the world would once again remind everyone that fame is fleeting, but humanity lasts forever. The ripple nobody saw coming. The next morning, long before the bank opened and the rush of 9-to-5ers poured in, Tanner James sat in his small apartment with a cold cup of coffee trembling in his hand. Sleep had been scarce, not from restlessness but reflection. Keanu Reeves, the Keanu Reeves, had come into his branch, stood before him as an ordinary man cloaked in humility, and offered a lesson Tanner could never have learned from any business school or training seminar. That wasn't just a customer interaction. That was a crossroads. And Tanner knew it. He played the moment over and over in his mind. The smirk on his own face, the dismissive tone, the sarcastic, "And I'm Elon Musk." It wasn't just a mistake. It was a wake-up call. All his life, Tanner had chased what he thought success looked like. Expensive watches, fast promotions, and the kind of reputation that made managers whisper about your leadership potential. But in one 10-minute exchange, Keanu had turned all of that upside down, and he hadn't done it with power or aggression. He'd done it with kindness that cut deeper than any reprimand. Back at Crestfall Bank, whispers had not stopped since the encounter. By the time Tanner arrived for his shift, the assistant manager, the branch director, and even a couple of district reps had already heard the story. Not from him. He hadn't told anyone, but from customers. One woman had posted on a community forum. Another wrote a heartfelt note to the bank's corporate email praising the humility of a movie legend and the importance of treating every person with dignity. The post had gone semi-viral overnight, amassing tens of thousands of shares, and Tanner's face, captured discreetly by a security camera screenshot, had become a symbol, for better or worse, of what it meant to judge too quickly. But Keanu never mentioned it to the media, never tweeted, never called for a public apology. In fact, after he quietly left the branch the day before, he disappeared into the city like a breeze through trees, silent, unseen, but leaving behind a shift in the air. The staff room buzzed with speculation. "I heard he's donating millions to mental health clinics," one teller whispered. "No, it's children's hospitals," said another. "He probably came in to close some massive real estate deal," a third chimed in. But Tanner knew better. Keanu hadn't come in to do anything flashy. He had come in simply to check on his account, to ask for help. That was it. And that truth made it all the more profound. By midday, Tanner was called into the branch manager's office. Mrs. Sloan, a stern but fair woman in her mid-50s, closed the door gently behind him. The silence in the room weighed heavier than the air. "You know why I called you in," she said, folding her hands on the desk. Tanner nodded. Yes, Mom. She didn't scold. She didn't shout. Instead, she reached into a drawer and pulled out a printed email. The one from the elderly woman who had been sitting in the corner of the bank when it happened. This came in last night, she said, sliding it toward him. Tanner read it slowly. The words etched themselves into his chest. We often forget that real wealth is invisible. It's in the way we treat strangers. Mr. Reeves reminded me that day that dignity doesn't wear a label, and empathy doesn't need a suit. Tanner looked up, voice cracking slightly. I was wrong. I treated him like he didn't belong here. Mrs. Sloane nodded but didn't interrupt. I didn't just judge him, he continued. I decided who he was before he had a chance to say anything. I saw the hoodie, not the man. And I hate that it took a celebrity to teach me that. She leaned back, sighing softly. We all get lost sometimes in the performance of professionalism. But Tanner, banks aren't just about numbers. They're about trust. If we lose that, we lose everything. He nodded, a lump forming in his throat. I want to make it right. Somehow. It wasn't about keeping his job anymore. It was about becoming the kind of man who didn't need reminders to treat people right. Later that week, something unexpected happened. A man walked into the branch with an envelope. He didn't say much, just handed it to the receptionist and left. When the envelope was opened, it revealed a note written in neat, elegant handwriting. To Tanner, mistakes are moments. Who we are comes from what we do next. See you soon. K. Tucked inside was a copy of a children's book titled The Boy, the Mole, the Fox, and the Horse. A story about compassion, vulnerability, and the power of kindness. Tanner read it that night from cover to cover. Then again, and again. He didn't know that Keanu had specifically asked a friend to drop it off quietly. He didn't know that Keanu had read the same book during a particularly painful time in his life. He didn't know that Keanu believed stories, simple ones, had the power to heal wounds more deeply than apologies ever could. But something shifted in him. Not overnight, not all at once, but slowly, like thawing ice. Over the next few days, the ripple that began at a bank counter spread through more than just the bank. A local news outlet picked up the Forum Post and published an article titled, Keanu Reeves Teaches Humility in Hoodie. It wasn't clickbait. It wasn't scandal. It was substance. It reminded readers, thousands of them, that judgment is often just fear wearing a tie. That respect should never be earned through status, but granted as a given. Emails flooded in from across the country. Veterans who had once been ignored in lobbies. Single mothers who remembered being overlooked in high-end stores. Teenagers who had watched their parents get treated poorly in corporate offices. The article became more than a story. It became a mirror. And in the heart of Los Angeles, Keanu Reeves continued his life as usual. Quiet, grounded, intentional. He never responded to the article, never posted about it. Instead, he visited a soup kitchen that weekend, anonymously, not to be seen, but to see, to remember, to connect. Back at Crestfall Bank, something strange began to happen. Customers started showing up not for transactions, but to talk, to share, to ask about that day. Some brought flowers, some brought stories. One elderly man came in with a sandwich wrapped in foil and said, I figured someone could use this more than I do. And then something even more powerful occurred. Tanner started listening. He began asking customers their names before their needs. He smiled, not the performative kind, but the kind that said, I see you. He started volunteering on weekends at a nonprofit youth center. He didn't announce it. He just did it. Because change isn't a campaign. It's a choice, repeated over and over again. The branch began to feel different, less sterile, more human. It became a place where dignity was expected, not exceptional. And somewhere in a quiet corner of the city, Keanu Reeves smiled as he read a letter that had been mailed to him weeks later. A handwritten note from Tanner. Thank you for not just teaching me a lesson, but for giving me the chance to become someone worth learning from. Keanu folded the note gently, tucked it into a drawer filled with memories and keepsakes. He didn't need the praise. He didn't need the recognition. What mattered most to him had always been simple: a world where people looked each other in the eye and chose to be kind, even when no one was watching. But what neither of them knew was that the story was far from over, because fate was winding its threads for something much bigger, something that would shake the city to its core. And this time, it wouldn't just be a quiet visit to a bank. It would be something that forced an entire system to confront the way it treated people, and Keanu Reeves, once again, would be at the heart of it. The meeting that was never supposed to happen. The wind was different that morning, heavier somehow, as though the city itself held its breath. Far across town, in a tall glass tower wrapped in chrome and corporate pride, the executive board of Crestfall Bank prepared for a quarterly meeting that, until now, had followed the same script for years. Graphs, numbers, cost-cutting, expansion, none of it ever changed. But today, the air buzzed with something unpredictable, because someone unexpected had been invited, not by title, not by rank, but by a ripple. You see, when the story of Keanu Reeves' quiet moment in the lobby of a local Crestfall branch caught fire online, the corporate office didn't know how to handle it. This wasn't a scandal. It wasn't bad press. But it was a reflection. A mirror turned toward a corporate culture that had long valued prestige over people. The article had exploded far beyond the city. National morning shows briefly touched on it. Podcasts explored the psychology behind judgment. Thousands of people had begun tagging Crestfall Bank on social media, sharing their own moments of being judged, ignored, or dismissed at bank counters across America. And at the center of it all, somehow, was Keanu Reeves. Not because he wanted to be, but because he simply existed in truth when others expected performance. The board, led by Chairman Douglas Penrose, a man of sharp suits and sharper instincts, had watched this unexpected movement swell. Initially, he rolled his eyes. One branch teller makes a fool of himself, and suddenly we're in a TEE talk. But his assistant had leaned in quietly and said, "Sir, he's not just anyone. It's Keanu Reeves." That changed everything. So, 3 weeks after that now legendary moment at the counter, a discreet invitation was sent to Keanu's representation. Not a formal press event, not a grand gala, just a quiet request. Would Mr. Reeves be open to speaking with the Crestfall executive team regarding recent events and his perspective on customer experience? No one expected him to say yes, but he did. No limousine, no cameras. He arrived in a rideshare car, wearing jeans, a dark jacket, and that same calm air that seemed to make even the elevators quieter. He walked into the conference room with no entourage, only a reusable coffee cup in hand and a quiet, polite good morning that made even the senior-most directors sit straighter in their seats. Penrose began the meeting with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Mr. Reeves, thank you for joining us. We understand you had an experience at one of our branches recently." Keanu tilted his head slightly, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I did, but I don't think it's about me." The room quieted. He set his coffee down and looked around the table, not with accusation, but with something rarer, curiosity. "I've seen both sides of this world," he began. "I stood on red carpets with the cameras flashing, and I've waited in food lines where people looked through me like I didn't exist. What I've learned is that respect shouldn't be transactional. It should be foundational." A murmur of agreement moved through the room, but Keanu wasn't finished. "I didn't come here to shame anyone. That teller, Tanner, he made a mistake, but he also changed, because someone gave him a chance to. I think your bank has the same opportunity." Penrose adjusted in his seat. "And what exactly are you suggesting, Mr. Reeves?" Keanu smiled gently. "Start a movement, not with a press release, but with people. Train your staff not just on policies, but on presence. Teach them to look at people, not through them. And maybe create something new, a program, a culture initiative Call it whatever you want. But make it real. The room fell still. It wasn't a demand. It wasn't even a pitch. It was an invitation. An invitation to be better. One of the younger board members, a woman named Sophia Lynn, leaned forward, clearly moved. What would you call it? Keanu looked thoughtful for a moment, then said softly, the human account. The words hung in the air like a prayer. You open one every time you meet someone. You make deposits with every act of kindness, and withdrawals every time you judge or diminish. I think the balance you carry there matters more than what's in your bank. Sophia scribbled it down like it was gospel. Penrose, for all his hard edges, stared at the actor before him with a slow, dawning realization. This wasn't some PR stunt. This man wasn't here for applause. He was here because he believed in something. And somehow, that belief was more powerful than any quarterly profit margin they'd reviewed that day. By the end of the meeting, it was clear. Keanu had sparked something. Something real. The board voted, unanimously, to launch an internal initiative titled the Human Account Project, with Keanu's blessing. Not using his name, not making him a mascot. Just honoring the principle he had lived by. Every employee, from tellers to executives, would undergo empathy training. Not the robotic kind, but immersive, reflective workshops led by community leaders, veterans, social workers, real people with real stories. And it didn't stop there. Crestfall created a new policy. Every branch would adopt a local charity or outreach mission, chosen by the staff. Community hours would be logged. Bonuses would no longer be based solely on numbers, but on kindness metrics submitted anonymously by clients and coworkers. It was revolutionary, and it all started with a moment most people would have overlooked. Meanwhile, Keanu didn't stick around for the applause. He left the tower as quietly as he entered, walking down the boulevard with his coffee cup still warm and his mind already somewhere else. That was his way. Do the right thing, then let the world take it from there. What he didn't know was that just a few blocks away, a young woman named Mia, 24, overworked and underpaid, balancing 2 jobs and a sick grandmother, was about to walk into that same branch where it all began. She wasn't dressed for attention. Her clothes were plain, her eyes tired, but she carried something most couldn't see: resilience. She had come to apply for a small business loan. It was her 3rd attempt that month. She had almost given up, but something told her to try one last time. What she didn't know was that behind the desk sat Tanner James, no longer the man who judged by appearances, but one who had been changed by one. And what they didn't know was that this meeting, this ordinary Tuesday afternoon interaction, would ignite something even bigger. Because kindness, once set in motion, doesn't just echo, it amplifies. The girl with the red binder. The sun was beginning to dip, casting long shadows across the tile floor of Crestfall's downtown branch as the door creaked open once more. Mia Delgado stepped inside quietly, unnoticed at first, her sneakers scuffed from long walks to save bus fare. In her arms, she held a worn red binder. The corners frayed, the cover speckled with fading stickers that had once meant something. She held it close like armor, a fragile shield made not of steel, but of stories, numbers, and dreams too fragile to say aloud. This was her last shot. She knew it. If this didn't work, she would shelf the cafe idea for good and accept the grim reality that the system wasn't made for people like her. But she had no idea that the very branch she entered was no longer the place it had once been, because one man in a hoodie had changed its pulse. Tanner James looked up from his desk, now lined with more books than bank policies. His demeanor had shifted in the weeks since Keanu's visit. His tie remained straight, his hair combed, but something behind his eyes had softened. He was no longer just calculating credit scores. He was reading people, listening, learning. And when Mia stepped up to the desk, her red binder clutched to her chest like a lifeline. He didn't see an inconvenience. He saw courage. She didn't speak at first, just handed the binder to him with hands that trembled ever so slightly. It's "It's for a cafe," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "I want to open one near my grandmother's apartment. She's not well. This is all I have." Tanner didn't ask about her income right away. He didn't point to risk thresholds or site policy. Instead, he opened the binder slowly, respectfully, like it was a sacred text. Inside, he found hand-drawn floor plans, a rough menu scribbled in colorful markers, pictures of elderly customers with handwritten notes beside them. "Mr. Alvarez likes sugar cookies after 3 p.m. Ms. Clara, diabetic, prefers mint tea." It wasn't a business plan. It was a love letter to a community. And Tanner, moved in a way he didn't expect, felt something well up in his chest. He looked at Mia. "Have you shared this with anyone before?" She nodded. "Twice. Both times they said it wasn't realistic. Too small. Too emotional." Tanner didn't answer right away. He turned the page to a hand-drawn map where she'd outlined walking routes for seniors in the neighborhood, routes that ended at her future cafe. It wasn't about profit margins. It was about belonging. "I think," he said slowly, "you just walked into the right branch at the right time." Mia's eyes blinked with disbelief. "You're serious?" He nodded. "Dead serious." He stood, walked over to the back office, and returned with something that hadn't been used in months, a community microloan program folder. It had been gathering dust, too often rejected by risk departments, but since the launch of the Human Account Project, it was quietly revived under the radar, championed by people like Sophia Lynn from the corporate board. And now, finally, ready to be put to use. "We just launched a new initiative," he explained. "Your cafe idea. It's not just a business. It's a service to a forgotten group. Let's start with the paperwork, and then I'll help you prep for the review." Tears welled up in Mia's eyes. She hadn't cried in months. She'd been too busy surviving. But something about this moment, about being seen without having to beg for it, split the dam inside her heart. She tried to speak, but Tanner gently shook his head and smiled. "We'll figure it out together." In the days that followed, the red binder became a symbol at the branch. Employees took turns helping Mia revise her proposal, even bringing pastries for taste testing. Customers began hearing about the idea. Some even asked to donate. What began as a single appointment at a desk soon became a community effort wrapped in the soft glow of second chances. Meanwhile, across the city, Keanu Reeves sat on a park bench with a paperback novel tucked under his arm, unaware of the storm he had unintentionally started. He didn't need to know, though, because he hadn't done it for acknowledgement. He had done it because it was right. But word reached him eventually. One morning, he received a small package from the Crestfall branch. Inside was a note on a red paper napkin. "Dear Mr. Reeves, your kindness became a key. Because of you, an entire neighborhood is about to have a new place to gather, smile, and remember they matter. With love, Mia." There was also a menu mock-up folded neatly beneath it, and at the top, the name of her future cafe stood proudly, The Human Being. Keanu chuckled softly to himself and looked up toward the sky. The sun filtered gently through the trees, and for a moment, he let the breeze carry the weight of all that had transpired. He knew the power of moments, how one act, seen or unseen, could become the quiet revolution someone else desperately needed. At Crestfall, the Human Account Project continued to evolve. Branches in other cities began adopting their own versions. Storyboards were set up in lobbies where clients could leave thank you notes for kind gestures they received from staff or fellow customers. Tellers were encouraged to take humanity breaks, 15-minute windows to speak with someone without rushing them, regardless of transaction size. Kindness was no longer a side effect. It was becoming part of the blueprint. But still, no one forgot the spark. The man in the hoodie. The one who didn't ask for recognition, but who quietly changed everything. And yet, the story was far from over. Because kindness, when planted in soil rich with sincerity, doesn't just grow roots, it sprouts branches that stretch toward places you never imagined. One of those branches was about to reach someone in the most unexpected corner of the city, a man who had spent his life believing people were disposable, that kindness was weakness, and that power came from fear. A man who hadn't crossed paths with Keanu Reeves yet, but fate was already drawing the map. And the next meeting wouldn't be gentle. The man who measured power in fear, in the cold corridors of corporate dominance, where glass skyscrapers reflected nothing but ambition, and the scent of espresso and entitlement filled every corner, there stood a man untouched by the ripple. Dominic Reeves, a name whispered in boardrooms and barked in conference calls, was not born of kindness. He was carved from conquest. The kind of man who measured success by how many people folded under his voice. At 54, he had built his empire on calculated intimidation, weaponizing silence just as effectively as sharp words. CEO of a massive investment firm, he walked like a man who believed the world was his chessboard, and people, disposable pawns. He didn't believe in kindness, not because he had never seen it, but because he had long ago decided it was for the weak. When his assistant mentioned a positive PR wave hitting Crestfall Bank, he dismissed it with a scoff. Another celebrity stunt, he muttered, barely looking up from his phone. Keanu Reeves, the guy who pretends to shoot people in slow motion. What's next? Empathy rewards cards. But something strange began happening. One by one, departments in his firm started shifting behavior. Junior analysts began asking deeper questions during client calls. His usually cutthroat HR director began implementing mental health hours. Even his personal assistant, normally reserved and stoic, had taken to leaving handwritten thank you notes on the desk. Dominic didn't like it. Empathy, in his world, was an infection. So when he learned that one of his junior partners had scheduled a meeting with some boutique cafe startup backed by a Crestfall microloan, he exploded. Why are we even looking at that? If it's tied to that ridiculous human account trend, kill the meeting. But the junior partner, Alan, 32, sharp but principled, stood firm. Sir, it's more than a cafe. It's become a community hub. And they're not looking for investment. They just need a vendor partnership. We'd be their first local supplier. And frankly, it's the right thing to do. Dominic stared at him like he'd grown a second head. Since when do we do things because they're right? Alan didn't answer. He simply slid the red menu mock-up across the table and left the room without permission. Dominic, curious despite himself, glanced down at it. The Human Bean. A ridiculous name, he thought. But then he saw something else, a photograph paperclipped to the back of the menu. It was a candid image, a small, quiet moment. A young woman, no older than 25, wiping down a table while an elderly man in a wheelchair smiled at her. It wasn't posed. It wasn't glossy. But it made something shift. Briefly, in his gut. He slammed the folder shut and pushed it away. But for the first time in years, he didn't sleep well that night. The next morning, driven more by irritation than interest, Dominic decided to attend the cafe's soft opening. Not officially, just to scope it out. He dressed in his signature steel gray suit, put on his watch that cost more than most people's cars, and had his driver parked 2 blocks away so he could walk in unannounced. Just another face in the crowd. Or so he thought. The cafe was small, humble, but buzzing with warmth. The walls were covered in photographs, not of celebrities, but of regulars, each with handwritten captions. Louis, first one here every morning. Nora, knits for local shelters. Alvin, survived the war and never stops smiling. There was no Wi-Fi, no digital kiosks, just soft music, real conversation, and the smell of fresh cinnamon rolls wafting through the air. And then he saw her. Mia, the girl with the binder. She didn't know who Dominic was. She didn't recognize him. She welcomed him the same way she welcomed everyone. By name, once she learned it. "Dominic, I'm Mia. Thanks for coming in. If you like strong coffee, I recommend the Resilience Roast." He gave a tight nod, unsure how to respond to her genuine tone. He sat in the corner, watching, observing. That's when something remarkable happened. An elderly man, shivering slightly, came in holding a cracked thermos. Without hesitation, Mia walked around the counter, hugged him gently, and filled his thermos without charge. "It's on the house, Jack, but you've got to tell me a joke like last time." Dominic stared. No one flinched. No one criticized her for breaking policy. The customers even clapped when Jack cracked a joke about marrying his dentist just to get free cleanings. This wasn't a cafe. It was a sanctuary. And for the first time in years, Dominic felt irrelevant, powerless, not in the sense that he had lost control, but because he realized control had no value here. No one feared him. No one knew him. And yet, everyone was fulfilled. He stood to leave, his pride quietly unraveling. But as he approached the door, it opened from the outside. And in walked the one man who could dismantle him with nothing but presence. Keanu Reeves, dressed in jeans and a hoodie. Again, calm, quiet, timeless. Their eyes met. No words at first, just recognition. Mia, beaming, rushed forward. "Keanu, you made it." Dominic blinked in disbelief. He knows her. Keanu smiled. "I wouldn't miss it. I've been looking forward to this." Mia handed him a cup of tea. "It's mint. Clara's favorite. She asked me to save you one." Keanu took it, looked around, and then his eyes landed on Dominic. He stepped over casually, offering his hand. "Hey, I don't think we've met." Dominic hesitated, but shook it. "Dominic Reeves." Keanu nodded. "Nice to meet you, Dominic. What do you think of the cafe?" He looked around, then met Keanu's gaze. "It's inefficient. No digital orders. Too much overhead on community giveaways. Probably won't scale well." Keanu chuckled softly. "Maybe not, but maybe it's not supposed to." Dominic tilted his head. "Then what's the point?" Keanu took a sip of tea, then gestured toward the room. "People walk in carrying things you'll never see on a spreadsheet. Grief, loneliness, hope. All they want is to feel human. Sometimes that's the whole point." Dominic had no rebuttal, only silence. Keanu smiled gently. "You know, the world will remember how you made people feel long after they forget what you built." And with that, he joined Mia behind the counter to help serve tea. Dominic left without saying goodbye. But something followed him home that day. Not regret. Not yet. But the unsettling suspicion that he had spent a lifetime climbing the wrong mountain. The balance that really matters. The rain fell gently against the windows of the human being that morning, not with storm, but with a quiet insistence, as though the sky itself was trying to wash something clean. Inside, the cafe glowed warm, like a lighthouse against the gray, with the rich scent of cinnamon, coffee, and something unnameable in the air. Something you couldn't bottle or brand. Belonging. It had been 3 months since Mia opened her doors. 3 months since her red binder transformed from a silent cry for help into the cornerstone of something sacred. In that time, the cafe had become more than a business. It had become a ritual, a pulse, a home for those who never had one, and a reminder for those who had forgotten what real wealth looked like. The photo wall had grown. Dozens of stories, hand-scrawled and full of life, filled the space where art once hung. But on this particular day, there was a new addition, an empty frame with a small inscription beneath it. Reserved for the story you haven't told yet. People paused at that frame more than any other. It reminded them that they still mattered, that their story was not over. Keanu Reeves sat at his usual table near the window, sipping his mint tea. He wore the same hoodie, the same calm expression, and yet, he had become something more than himself in this place. Not a celebrity, not an icon, Just a man who quietly reminded people that kindness wasn't seasonal, it was muscle. And like all muscles, it grew only when exercised. Tanner visited regularly now, always bringing cookies for the regulars, often staying late to help mop floors or take out trash. He called it his humanity whore, an idea now adopted by 3 other branches across the city. What began as a single mistake, a single misjudgment, had become his greatest transformation, not because he was forgiven, but because he had chosen to grow. But today, all eyes were not on Keanu. They were on the man who walked in, slowly, deliberately, through the front door. Dominic Reeves. No steel gray suit, no Rolex, just slacks, a sweater, and a face that looked like it had spent the night wrestling with the parts of himself he had long avoided. Mia looked up from the counter, her smile as warm as ever. "Dominic, welcome back." He nodded, not with the sharp jerk of a CEO, but the quiet respect of someone humbled. "Do you mind if I sit for a bit?" Keanu, from his table, offered a quiet nod. "Sit with me." So he did. They didn't talk for a while. The room hummed with soft conversations, the occasional burst of laughter, the sound of coffee being poured like music. Finally, Dominic broke the silence. "I used to think people were only valuable if they produced something." Keanu didn't respond. He simply waited. "I measured everything. Output, efficiency, profit. I thought empathy was a weakness, that being feared meant being respected." He paused, looked down at his hands. "I don't know if I believe in anything anymore, but when I came here, I felt something I hadn't in years." Keanu finally spoke. "You felt human." Dominic nodded, slowly. "I don't know how to be anything else anymore." Keanu smiled. "Then you're already on the right path." Mia brought them both fresh tea without being asked. No bill, no expectations, just presence. And in that simple moment, 2 men, once galaxies apart, sat at the same table. Not as symbols, not as power or fame, but as people. Later that week, something extraordinary happened. Dominic returned with a proposal. Not a business deal, not a hostile takeover, but a pledge. He wanted to fund a scholarship program for underserved youth in Los Angeles to pursue community-based business projects. He called it the Empty Frame Fund. The idea: everyone had a story that hadn't been told yet, and it was time to help them write it. He asked Mia to lead it. He asked Keanu to quietly advise it. He asked Tanner to speak at the first launch ceremony. No cameras, no headlines. Just a room full of people who had once been invisible, now being invited to build. Months passed, then a year. The human being expanded, not with franchises or branding, but with mentorship. Mia's model inspired other community cafes. Tanner's branch was named the most customer-centered branch in the state. Dominic stepped down as CEO of his firm, not in shame, but in clarity. He joined the board of the Human Account Project and became its loudest advocate. And Keanu, he continued as he always had, quiet, present, intentional. But one morning before sunrise, Mia walked into her cafe and found a small box waiting at the front counter. Inside was a framed photograph. Her, Tanner, Dominic, and Keanu all laughing together in front of the wall of stories. And beneath the photo, written in soft black ink, "Real balance is not measured in dollars. It's measured in moments. Thank you for being one of mine. K." She hung it beside the empty frame on the wall. Customers would point to it sometimes and ask, "Who are they?" Mia would smile. "Just people. Just a reminder that every one of us is worth more than we know." The world didn't change overnight. It rarely does. But sometimes, it only takes one moment, one person refusing to judge, one act of unexpected kindness to start a ripple. And in this story, that ripple began with a man in a hoodie and a balance no one saw coming.